Welcome to Votechat, brought to you by the Department of Politics at Otago University. I'm Carlini. We're here before a live audience and we're also live streaming, so welcome to everyone who's joining us today. As always, we encourage you to put your questions to our guest via Twitter, and here's Sam to tell you how you can do that.
Thanks, Dale. Today, as usual, we'll be accepting questions for our guest via social media. Today we are joined by Helen Kelly, who is the President of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. If you have any questions for Helen, you can tweet them to us via our Twitter handle @OUVotechat. Alternatively, you can use the hashtag Votechat14. But for now, back to Dale.
Thanks, Sam. Our guest today is Helen Kelly, the President of the Council for Trade Unions. Welcome to Otago University.
Thank you.
There's a lot we want to get through today because it's kind of an interesting time, and there's a odd book that's come out recently that might be worth being part of our discussion. But before we do that, just quickly, a little bit about you. So I saw in a profile that you were described, and I think you described, that you have unionism and politics running through your blood. Explain that to me.
Well, yes, I grew up in a union family. Both my parents were very active unionists, and my father was a prominent trade unionist, Pat Kelly.
Pat Kelly,
so I guess, I grew up on the picket line. They were involved in, the Vietnam War and the Springbok Tour and all of those major New Zealand sort of historical political events of that time. And then I went on to after teaching for a bit, to become involved in the teachers' unions. But all through my working life, if I was working in a service station or a hotel or, regardless, I've been a member of a union and active, yeah.
You've got a law degree?
Got a law degree.
And that helps you in all of your work immensely, I imagine.
Yeah, it was a very interesting education, actually, the law education from Victoria University, and, really taught me how to look at the law and to think about the strategic use of the law. So I use it all the time.
Okay, so this election, let's talk about this election because it's getting quite interesting at the moment, isn't it?
Getting quite close too.
Getting quite close. So I want to talk about the relationship between the unions and the Labour Party at the start of things. But before we do that, I think we better talk about Nikki Hager's book. Because it was launched yesterday. It's starting to wind up in the media now.
Yep.
Have you had a chance to look at that book?
I've read some of it. I got the last 4 copies in Dunedin, I understand. So
you read 4 copies?
Sold out in Wellington, so I was required to bring some home with me.
Right.
But yeah, I've read some of it and it's extremely disturbing, the things that I've read. And really there has to be some serious questions asked about some of the specific events in that book.
Okay, let's look at them. From your perspective, what have been some of the more interesting things, given that you haven't probably had time to digest the whole thing?
Sure. Well, the bit that I guess is of most interest to me, and particularly to the union movement, is the chapter which records the relationship between Cameron Slater and the Port of Auckland during that very, very nasty port dispute, where the port planned to sack its entire workforce and contract in cheap labour to do that work. And if people remember, there was an absolute attack on the integrity of those workers that were working on that port, and at the time there were breaches of their privacy, there were a total dissemination of information from the port to the blogger about personal records, leave records, that sort of thing.
This was a young man who...
Well, the prime example was when a young man spoke on Radio New Zealand, Cecil Walker, about why he was on strike and how he didn't want to accept the new contracting conditions because he had young kids. His wife had died of cancer. He had young kids and he wanted to know that he had regular work and could, factor in his family life. And he knew from other ports where they use contract labour that they were expected to be on demand the whole time without regular hours and that sort of thing. And the next day on the Whale Oil blog site was... Cecil's leave records were published, personal records about how much leave he had taken when his wife was dying of cancer. And it was intended to humiliate him. And the blog said, that he was basically lazy and ungrateful and all of that sort of thing. And at the time, we accused the port. The information could only have come from the port, and that has proved to be true. But what we didn't know, and if you read the book, the suggestion is that there were close relationships between the chairman of the board, Mr. Pearson, who was a public figure during that dispute, and Cameron Slater, and they spoke regularly according to Cameron Slater. And there's a proposition in the book that in fact the port was paying for that work, and we've asked the question, was the port paying Whale Oil to breach and to attack its workforce during that dispute?
Are you doing this through a court process?
No, I mean, this issue
process.
is still in front of the court, actually, and sure, this book is going to be used, I imagine, in the court case. But we've asked, this port in Auckland is owned by the people of Auckland. It's basically an asset of the Auckland City Council, and if they've got management running a political agenda through a blog like Whale Oil and paying him to do illegal acts, breaching the privacy information, was a breach of the Privacy Act, but paying someone like him to attack their workforce, then the Mayor needs to ask serious questions.
So how important is this book in terms of the election process? I mean, it was launched yesterday, so it might be
Sure.
early, but what do you think its significance is?
Well, it's an important book. It doesn't matter whether it's important to the election process, time will tell that. And it's not about whale oil, it is about the Prime Minister and his office and his ministers and the things that they have done. Whale oil is a completely insignificant player in this book. This is about our Crown, the state, and what it does. And there are stories in the book, suggestions of moving prisoners around at the behest of some private individuals, of using SIS files to create Official Information Act requests and to get information out into the public. There are questions in the book that New Zealanders should be concerned about in the long term, regardless of the election outcome and what influence it might have on it.
Mm. So there'll be a lot coming out in the next few days, so we'll be able to follow that one quite closely in terms of those
I hope
ones you're
there
talking
will.
about.
I hope there will. If this just turns into a debate about whether Cameron Slater's a good guy or whether the emails were stolen or all of the different things that currently are being the focus, rather than the detail in this book about what is contained in those emails, then New Zealanders will be the worse for it, because it can't go on like this if this is what's happening. There has to be questions asked of the Prime Minister, of his office, about whether... I mean, one of the stories in the book, I don't know whether people will remember this, but a young man was killed in a car crash on the West Coast, and his brother had been killed in the Pike River mine. And Whale Oil put a headline up about the family being feral. This is a family that had just lost their actually it turned out to be more than their second son, but their second son in a short period of time, and he accused the family of being feral. Well, in the book, it suggests that John Key rang Cameron Slater to express support. He got a lot of criticism for running that headline, obviously, to express support, and in that conversation may have said very nasty things about that family. Now, John Key is down on that West Coast all the time, patting the heads of those Pike River mine families, saying, we'll look after you, we're sorry for what happened, we'll try and sort this out. If in the background he's supporting someone running that sort of line, that also raises questions about his integrity for me.
Mm. There'll be a lot to follow. You're wearing a badge of the to do with Pike River.
I always wear this badge, yeah. Okay,
so you were involved in that process around Pike River?
Yes, we're very involved, and we were very distressed at the dismissal, the decision to dismiss the charges against Peter Whittle. There are a couple of families challenging that. We're very supportive of that process to hold those people involved in Pike River to account, but we're also involved in a major health and safety campaign to improve health and safety for future workers, and those Pike families are helping us with that.
So workforce safety is one of the platforms which your organisation is focused on.
Sure.
So the mining industry is one, forestry is another one that is getting increasing attention at the moment. What do you say needs to happen, and how should that be impacting this election?
Well, the story of work safety in New Zealand is the story of labour market deregulation in New Zealand. And if you have a look at who's being hurt in New Zealand workplaces, the 5 most dangerous industries are primarily de-unionised with very poor working conditions and very few workers' rights. Forestry, fishing, agriculture, construction and manufacturing. And that is no coincidence in our view. So today we are supporting 2 families who are in the Rotorua District Court seeking leave to take prosecutions in relation to the deaths of their family members in forestry. 900 serious harm injuries in forestry since 2008 out of a workforce of 6,500. There are over 1,000 workers in New Zealand, forestry workers on ACC, who have been on ACC for more than a year. So badly injured are they in this work. And last year, 10 deaths. And these workers are being paid some of the lowest wages, working some of the longest hours in some of the poorest conditions in a poorly regulated industry. No requirement for lighting, no requirement to call off and get paid in wet weather, no driving time payments when they're driving for hours and hours and hours. The combination of what's gone on in forestry is what's gone on for working people. So we are calling for improved health and safety across the board. Forestry is our focus at the moment, but agriculture had 20 deaths last year in agriculture. Remuneration went down on dairy farming last year in one of their boom years. I mean, these industries are in crisis, and we intend to use the stories of these workers to drive up a call for better safety.
So what's the macro picture? Why is this happening? Why is the real wages not happening?
Yeah, well, our view is that the deregulation of the labour market was intended for this to happen, and this is the result. It was predicted this is what would happen, and this is the result. So 46% of Kiwis didn't get a pay increase last year at all. 90% of union members in collective agreements got a pay increase, and that is why the government is attacking collective bargaining, because that is where the few remaining people getting a pay increase are getting it from, through collective bargaining. So wages, the design of the system is that wages will be decreased and that we will be a low wage economy. 50% of Kiwis are now saying that they worry week to week about whether they'll pay their bills. Not some sort of marginalised poor group, but 50% of New Zealanders now worry if at payday they'll have enough money to continue through. So there is a real crisis, and some of our most profitable industries are paying some of the lowest wages. So construction, agriculture, forestry, food retail, banking. There's no match between ability to pay and payment. It's purely about bargaining power. And just before Christmas, the government was intending to pass new law, and John Banks, they found out what we all knew, that John Banks was a crook and lost their majority and couldn't get the law through. That law was intended to not only remove the tea break and the lunch break for all workers as a statutory minimum entitlement. You have to ask, who would do that? What was the cabinet conversation? We'll read Nikki's book if you want to see what the cabinet conversation might have been. But anyway, but it was to remove the duty of employers to conclude collective agreements. So to allow them to walk away from collective bargaining for the few remaining workers that are getting pay increases in this country.
So that was held up, and it's legislation that's still on the table?
Sure. So John Key says it will be a priority if they get re-elected. And so what we've got, in less than 40 days, New Zealanders have a choice between continued attacks on collective bargaining, on tea breaks and lunch breaks, on the right to join a union, on health and safety. That's one option on the table, because John Key said that's his priority. Or the opposition parties, like Labour and the Greens, who are saying they'll raise the minimum wage within the first 100 days and then again by April next year, bring in industrial legislation that gets rid of the 90-day law, which sees people being dismissed, the youth rates. There'll be people at this university being paid on these youth rates now, and bring in industrial legislation that allows workers like forestry workers, farm workers, construction workers to collectively bargain. Real choices.
So, in your view, it's an election of choice.
Absolutely.
We know what National's position is. Is Labor taking the position that you're...
Yes, that is Labor's policy. They've announced it, and the Greens are announcing their policy next week. Labor has said all of those things in its election manifesto, that it will change the employment law to make freedom of association and collective bargaining easily accessible. What we see in forestry is there is no union in forestry. When we've set one up, it's beginning to generate members, but to join a union in forestry, firstly, is a risk. Forest owners have made it very clear they don't appreciate union involvement in this industry. But secondly, if you think of 300 contractors all working out there in the bush in tiny gangs, how are they meant to? They're not a university staff that can all get together and meet and plan their claims and have industrial power. They will never have industrial power without the right to bargain as an industry.
Okay. So, this brings us to the position of, you're not a candidate. Most of the candidates that people that we've been chatting to over the last few months have been candidates running in this upcoming election. But you're not a candidate, you're what I'd call an influencer.
Aren't I lucky?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question as to why you're not a candidate. But you're not a candidate, you would be called an influencer in the process, and your organisation would be an organisation that influences the political process. So, that influence is largely through the Labor Party. Am I correct in that?
No, we're not affiliated to the Labor Party. There's a big misunderstanding about this. So there are 36 unions that belong to the CTU, all the biggies really, except for the police. And some of them belong to the Labor Party, are directly affiliated and vote and select their candidates, participate in all of that, or participate in the selection of the candidates, participate in policy development, have put remits up to the Labor Party conference. But the bulk of union members belong to unions that are not affiliated to the Labor Party. Our influence is with the 360,000 workers who join unions and who want decent working conditions, want the right to do that, to collectively bargain and want to protect things like health and safety. Can I just say that the forestry accident rate this year has halved, and that it was 180 workers were seriously harmed last year, and this year it's almost half, and that for the half of the year, and that shows the influence of unions. Actually, people should think about what happened between last year, when all those workers were killed and injured, and this year. The difference is those workers have got a voice. Finally, they're able to speak up, have a say, demand safety, and the result is that the accident rate is half. And it could have been half last year and the year before and the year before that if successive national governments hadn't removed the right for those forestry workers to easily access unions. And so our job is to influence working people to think about that when they vote. Think about their economic and social interests and those of their families.
So going back to this Labor link, you fund the Labor Party, your members fund the Labor Party?
No, we don't have any union members, we only have unions. And some of their members are in unions that are affiliated. So the EPMU, for example, has union members and they are affiliated to the Labor Party. Engineering, Printing and Manufacturing Union. Yep. The Service and Food Workers Union, the Meat Workers Union, they're affiliated directly to the Labor Party and they pay a Labor Party fee to the Labor Party, but we don't.
So there's about 6 big unions that are affiliated with the Labor Party, I think. So then there's an influence in unions, and this was a debate around the time of the election of the new Labor leader between the 3 candidates, and it was that the David Cunliffe didn't appear to have the support of his caucus, but he had support of the unions and members. Now, why would that be? What's the dynamic behind that?
I don't have to explain that because it's not, it's not my process. But the reality is he did get good support from the caucus. He didn't get the majority support from the caucus, but he got good support from the caucus, and he got good support from the members and good support from the unions, and that's what happened. And it was a democratic process. But most of the unions didn't participate in that process because they're not affiliated to the Labor Party, and those that did asked their members to vote, and that's quite a legitimate and quite a powerful position for them to be able to assess Labor Party policy, to influence it, and in the interests of working people. Thank goodness someone is doing that, in my view, because actually policy for working people needs to be improved in this country. The trajectory, if what's going on now just continues on and continues on for the next 20, 30 years, then this sort of poverty, working poverty, the sort of workplace accident rate, the low wages, the decline in working quality will continue. That is the trajectory. That is what National intended to do with that piece of legislation that they were going to introduce.
So let's look at some of the policies that you've framed as being very important for this election.
Sure.
So the living wage, you're talking about poverty, you're talking about the difficulties that families are having. What's your focus around the living wage? Well,
the living wage campaign is an amazing campaign, actually, in my view, where it's really connected in with community groups, with church groups, and the unions have collaborated together. And if you think about the concept of a living wage, it says 2 things. One is that people are working and not getting a living wage. And the other is that a living wage should be the deal when you go to work. The reciprocal deal should be that if you're working in this country, you should be earning a wage that allows you to live decently. And that campaign is about wages. It's about driving up wages, obviously, where they approach employers that want to do that want to pay the living wage, that can understand the economic and social value of that, and sign up and get accredited as a living wage employer, and more employers are doing that. So that policy is separate from the political process in a way. What Labor have committed to do is that anybody that works for the government will get the living wage, because there shouldn't be people working in our core public sector being paid below a living wage. They should be setting a standard there. But what we would like to see is the minimum wage go to 2/3 of the average wage, which coincidentally lines up almost with the living wage, actually. But we want the minimum wage. 300,000 workers in this country earn on or near the minimum wage. Usually in most countries the minimum wage is sort of the exception. In New Zealand it's the rule. And we think increases in that will dramatically improve both local economies, provincial economies, where many, many people are earning wages that are too low to sustain local cafes, local theatres, local activity, but also we'll see lots and lots of families lifted out of pretty dire poverty.
So across the other parties, there's a pretty reasonable support?
I'm sure that when the Green Party releases its policy next week, I can't speak about that until it's released, that they'll have very similar industrial relations policy. We've worked very well with them.
Okay, so that's another question really, because you've got a known relationship with Labor. What's your relationship with the other parties? The Greens, for example, Mana, those ones?
We work closely with the Greens, and you know, there's a lot of union members who support their movement and participate in it. We worked with the Mana Party before the Internet Mana Party, obviously, in Parliament, you know, in terms of opposing legislation, and New Zealand First voted against all of that industrial legislation that's come through over the last 6 years. We've had no dealings with the Internet Mana Party, you know, at this stage. They're very new, and you know, presumably post-election, we see them as potential allies if they get into Parliament.
So you don't have an objection to working with them, you just haven't had the opportunity?
No, and we haven't seen their industrial relations policy. I mean, you know, they're sort of making policy now and releasing policy now, but we expect, given the Mana influence in it, I guess, because we've worked well with them in the past, that policy will align with the sorts of things that will enhance the lives of working people.
So what's the relationship with National like, between your union movement?
It's a professional relationship. You know, we have to continue to work with the government of the day. That's what workers expect us to do our best. But I have to say, it's been a really, really hard government on working people. If you have a think about the range of things that they've done, including on work rights, things like the 90-day law. We have incredible stories coming through our office of people who have been mistreated under that law, outrageously treated under that law without any rights, of things like the introduction of youth rates, which we've seen a number of very hard-working young people, you know, really struggling on very low wages with the youth rates, of the attacks on things like union access, which is stopping vulnerable workers getting access to their union when they want them, the changes to personal grievances. Reinstatement is no longer the primary remedy if you're dismissed unfairly. Why shouldn't you be put back in the position that you were in before the injustice? Along with the climate of driving down public sector wages and laying off workers, lack of investment in economic development where jobs are, like manufacturing and wood processing, it's been a hard time for working people in this country, and they feel it. And they tell you about it, and they describe how 10 years ago they were better off than they are now. You talk to a group of forestry workers, they would have had a 20-cent increase an hour in the last 4 years and be on $16 an hour. And they'll tell you 10 years ago they were earning that and they were better off. So, yeah.
So if I took the devil's advocate side of the other side of that debate, they would say, well, we need our focus is on productivity and having a productive economy. And we need to make sure that wages are kept in a balance within that economy. So
they don't say that. They say wages need to go up, and then they do everything in the opposite to actually allow that to happen. I mean, Bill English has the cheek to say at conferences, wages will go up, wages will go up. Well, he's been saying that for 6 years, and they haven't gone up. And working people know that because 75% of Kiwis earn their primary source of income from wages and salaries. They don't have shares, they don't have second properties that they rent out, they don't have businesses, they earn their income from working, and they know that their wages haven't gone up, and they know that there's no mechanism for that to happen in the system. And in fact, the Cabinet papers supporting the law that National was about to bring in and will bring in say this law will allow wages to be decreased. That's what they say. So
this inequality, therefore, is a term that comes up a lot now. It's a perception and conception that's in our political lexicon. So, is it real?
Oh,
You're saying
yes,
it is.
Of course, it's real.
There's a division that's.
There's nobody saying inequality is not real. People are just arguing about what to do about it or whether it even matters. But of course, it's very real. Yes.
Okay, and that takes us to something that I've heard you talk about before, the TPP. In terms of you're opposed to the TPP, why?
Lots of reasons. Obviously, it's a complicated conversation, but that trade agreement, in our view, will hinder New Zealand's economic and social development long term. It will restrict the laws that any future government might want to bring in. If governments, for example, want to bring in legislation to allow the public development of businesses that the private sector are currently in. So, for example, we hope to see the end of charter schools in this country. We think we've got a beautiful public. Well, we think we've got a beautiful public education system, quite unique to have 97% of our kids going to public schools. Amazing educational results if you look at international data. Obviously some challenges, but real capacity to have every kid in New Zealand going to a decent school, and the social benefits that having kids in the state system bring. But under the TPP in the future, it may be impossible for a government to say change a charter school where there's been private investment in it. Pharmac, which we know brings easy access to good drugs in this country and controls the medical bill, we know that's under attack. Intellectual property, copyright provisions, the continued privatisation of public assets like water, plants and intellectual knowledge. We know that this is not a trade agreement actually, this is a rules agreement. They're making an agreement on what sort of rules countries can make for themselves, and we don't think that's in New Zealand's interest. We can't anticipate everything that might be developed and happen in the future, but regardless, in democratic countries, we should be able to elect governments to do the things we want and not have these trade agreements which allow companies to sue our government in existence. We don't think they're in our interest.
It's a changing world in terms of the globalisation of everything. We're into a lot more transnational experience from everything from security to economics. Is it realistic to say that we shouldn't be part of it? Is it realistic to say that this is not the... Is it just specifically this one, or is it all of these kind of international trade agreements?
We don't oppose all international trade agreements, but we look at each one and we say, are they in the interest of the bulk of New Zealand people? And we don't think this one is, and we've got concerns about other ones as well. But basically, this is the biggie, right? This is the biggie that will tie all of these different countries together. It's secretive. Nobody can get to see the details, so nobody can say it's responding to a changing world and what sort of world they're anticipating in terms of that change. And many union movements in countries where this agreement is being negotiated are extremely concerned about it. So the US unions are very concerned about the impact on US workers. And there aren't things in there. It's a changing world. There aren't things in there like strong labour rights. There's no acknowledgement that labour can be used in an anti-competitive way, that if you can be the cheapest and the most exploitative of your labour, you can get a trade advantage. Those aren't deeply embedded in TPP, provisions. So we can see the world is changing. We would like to see the world changing in a way that's inclusive of the world's population and not exploitative, and we think this one will be.
So how's the mechanism? What's the ideal mechanism for a future world in your worldview? So how, if it's not these kind of agreements, what should be happening? Well,
we're trading with lots of countries that we don't have trade agreements with, right? This is not a trade agreement. This is an agreement about restricting statutory legislation in country that might hinder private enterprise. That's fundamentally what it's aimed to do, to protect private investment into countries, regardless of whether that private investment, whether attitudes to that investment changes over time. And we've seen, for example, tobacco, where there's been a huge change in attitude to the tobacco company rights to sell tobacco in country, and we, there's a lot of challenges around other products. So it's not a trade agreement, it's being sold as that, but we're trading all over the world. We're selling our stuff. In fact, the problem is actually that the stuff that we should be trading, we're not processing properly, we're not developing, we're not investing in, and that we run the risk of having very little left to trade except primary products if we don't invest more in R&D and into that sort of infrastructure. Trading's not the problem. The problem with this agreement is the way that it will tie up future governments. And in our view, the way to trade in the future is to have fair trade arrangements with countries which are mutually beneficial to the people that live in them.
All right. Okay, because there's a lot of change. In terms of coming up, even robotics. There's a lot of drone technology. There's things that are going to change the fundamental nature of labour, aren't they?
Well, they've been saying that since the Jetsons, haven't they? There's more people employed in New Zealand now in terms of participating in the workforce than ever before. It used to just be Dad Now it's, everybody working. The last figures show more people are participating. But, since the Jetsons, I've been saying machines will replace workers. That's the big threat. If you expect decency at work, you'll be replaced, you'll be made redundant. You should be fearful of seeking a decent working life. And that's all part of the fear narrative that's been created around workers. I mean, this idea that businesses are big charities, benefactors, workers are beneficiaries of those jobs, shouldn't bite the hand that feeds them, should be grateful to have a job. It's a whole wave of opinion being expressed to stop working people expecting anything else for business. And you see it all the time. I mean, you see it when you see the CEO of Pike River speaking to the State Memorial, sitting on that stage after 29 men have been killed in that mine, able to say workers were attracted to Pike River because of its safety culture. I mean, business in this country is treated with such deference. And workers are treated as if they are the takers in this arrangement, that there's no reciprocity in that exchange. And one of the things employers do is threaten you with redundancy. Well, I can tell you what, there are more jobs in forestry and farming and those sorts of areas, banking and retail work, than there were many years ago, and yet the wages are going down and down and down, and the income share is going down and down and down, and they haven't been replaced by machines yet.
So what's the driver? You're talking about TPP. You talk about these sort of situations where these things are being driven down, real wages. What's the fundamental philosophical change in this country? What's happened?
I think we've basically, obviously been dominated by the neoliberal market agenda, and that's been played out in a whole range of areas. And people have lost the ability to collectivise around work since 1991. So the whole debate that used to happen through the union movement in collective bargaining around what was a decent workplace and what was fair wages has been lost as each workplace has been broken into little segments. And I think, some of the very, very extreme right-wing narrative and story has been just simply imposed on us. And if you read Nikki's book, you can see it's quite a deliberate strategy to do that, and that's made people fearful. Working people are fearful of their economic security. When you've got very little, when you've got low wages, you can take no risk really in terms of working out whether you can make that any better. And I just think it's just been this slow erosion. People are shocked when we talk about forestry. And when we talk about Charles Finlay, who was killed in the bush in July last year, home at 6 o'clock at night, the night before he was killed, back at work by 4 the next morning, dead by 5:30 in Tokoroa in the middle of the winter, in the middle, dark, unlit site, no requirement to light it. Really the middle of the night, middle of the winter, on $16 an hour after 27 years in the bush. People are shocked by that story, but that is the reality of work in the bush. And now he's dead. And his kids, his 10-year-old kids, are living on 80% of his income on ACC. And that is the reality of work in the forest. And that is not what it used to be. 70% of the income from forest used to be shared with forestry workers. It's now down to 30%. And on top of that, they're getting these sorts of injuries, deaths, working every minute that life brings them. And for some reason, that's deemed acceptable. And the forest owners can say things like, the union will exploit these workers if they come into this industry. You think about that statement when you think about what's going on in forestry. So bold are they by the narrative that they're the benefactors and the workers of the charities. They're prepared to accuse us that we might exploit these workers if we were to offer them a voice and organise them.
So we've had some years go by. We've had the deregulation, we've had the Contracts Act, that Employment Contracts Act that came in early 90s? 91. And then we've had these years, and you're saying this narrative has been able to establish. Why hasn't your narrative or the narrative of those on the other side of it been able to cut through? There's been time. There's been time for people to be under pressure, and it hasn't changed. I mean, we've got John Key now with, high figures of popularity. Mm-hmm. We've got Labor falling again, I think, in the last day or so. What's not happening? What's not happening successfully for that side?
I mean, I think when you have these conversations with people, they get it. But actually the opportunity to have these conversations has been completely diminished by the attack in 1991. If people remember Bill Birch, most people are trying to forget him, but if you do remember him, he said at the time, this law will not only defeat the union movement, but it will at the time he said, get rid of Labor, the opposition. That's what he said on Australian television. But actually it was a huge blow to working people. I mean, it's all right to focus on the union movement, but if you have a look at what it did, forestry workers had a timber workers union at the time of the Employment Contracts Act, decimated when those companies were broken up into 300 contracting companies. It denied them of the opportunity to discuss what was going on. Now that we've pulled them together, they're all shocked to hear each other's wages. They all sort of thought that maybe they were the only one earning these types of wages. We always make them tell each other what they're earning, and they're all shocked by what they're earning. So I think we have been continually undermined, and John Key has the media every day to put across his narrative. Bill English can stand up and say he hopes wages will go up while he's passing legislation for wages to go down, and nobody seeks to ask him that question. Is there a mismatch here? So we're doing our best to try and fight back and portray the stories of real working people. The Living Wage campaign does that, the Forestry campaign does that, the Fairness at Work campaign does that. But all the time, we're having to fight every step of the way just to get in the door. And, the regulator's been absent. I'm representing a young woman today who was doing vineyard work, who didn't get paid, who's gone back overseas. I get an email today from MB saying she can take a case to the Employment Relations Authority if she likes. She's a young backpacker in Germany. This is their job, to impose the minimum code, to seek wages. Theft as a servant is a very serious crime. Theft as an employer, you have to come back from Germany and file a case with the Employment Relations Authority and, hope you can track down who this dodgy person is. The narrative is so strongly against working people. It's a big job.
We've got a question that's come in. Sam.
We've received a question via email. What do unions stand to gain from their Let's Get Out and Vote initiative?
Well, that's a good question.
That's a good question. I've got the badge on.
You've got the badge on.
Let's get out and vote.
So let's talk about that. It's a fundamental platform of your organisation.
Yes, so this is our primary focus in the period now leading up to the election, is to get voter turnout. We've got a very systematic system of talking to people about their voting plan. So the ballot box is open on the 3rd of September till the 20th of September, and for the first time ever, people can vote early without a reason. So they don't used to have to be out of the country on election day or going to be working. You used to have to have an excuse. You can now go in and vote early. And we are trying to mobilise voting people to think about, are you a voter? Most people will say, yes, I am a voter. Do you have an intention to vote early? Would you like to know where the ballot boxes are? Can you take people with you? And 1 million people didn't vote last election. And of those, only 200,000 had not voted before. So we think those other 800,000 will get out and vote if they're given support to do that. We're phoning thousands and thousands and thousands of people and talking through with them a voter plan. Do you know that you can vote early? Have you thought about taking your sons, your daughters, your cousins with you and maybe going and having a coffee and going down and voting together and expressing the vote? If you vote early, you can enrol at the same time and the vote will count. So that's a big bonus, getting young people down there. If you vote on the election day and you're not on the roll, they'll give you a lovely special vote. They won't tell you, but the vote won't count. Most people don't know that. If you're not on the roll on the 20th of September, they'll give you a voting paper because they're required to by law. You'll fill it all in, special vote, and then it will be discarded in the count.
It's discarded in the process?
Yep. If you're not on the roll, it won't be counted. If you vote early between the 3rd of September and the 19th, you can enrol at the time and the vote will be counted. But on the 20th of September, if you're not on the roll, it's not the person in the ballot box's job to say you can't have a vote, it won't be counted, because they can't make that decision, but it won't be counted. And I sit in a ballot voting booth on election day and I see the same families come in election after election after election, cast a special vote because they're not on the roll. I feel like shouting, it won't be counted. But you're not allowed to do that.
So the two processes is to get on the roll.
Yep.
And then
vote. And we've got 5,000 volunteers, we've got hundreds of thousands of phone numbers. We're going to be phoning people and talking through with them a voter plan, because the research suggests if they have a plan to vote, yes, I'm going to vote on Tuesday, I'm going to go down to the local post office in Dunedin, I'm going to take my son with me and my husband and my daughter, we're going to go down and vote. If they think that through, then they will do that. And we hope to increase the turnout, partly because we think if more people vote, you get a more legitimate result, but also we are concerned that people are disengaging from the system.
1 million people.
Yeah.
It's a pretty significant figure, isn't it?
It is.
They're disengaged because?
Well, we haven't done that research, but somebody does need to do that. Why are people not voting? We think there is a deliberate strategy, and if you read pushing Nikki's book here, but you can see that strategy is to generate this idea that all politicians are useless and you shouldn't support any of them, and that is very dangerous because someone's going to win the election. That I can tell you for certain, and they will be the government in this country for the next 3 years, and they will make a hell of a lot of decisions that will affect our future. So someone's going to win, so people should get out and vote and participate in that. For the first time ever, the polytechs and universities will be in session during an election. Usually it's in November and everybody's gone home, so that is an exciting opportunity, and I understand there will be early voting here at the university. So there are real opportunities to increase participation this time round.
Mm. What's going to happen in this election? What's going to happen? I mean, it could go anywhere?
It's extremely close. And if you look at the underlying polling figures, anybody could win. There could be a change of government, and obviously that's what we hope to get, a government that supports working people into the future. It's extremely close, and it will be determined by the number of people that participate, which is why our Get Out and Vote is incredibly important, the number of people that participate, and if the policies of the parties actually get a chance to be aired rather than all the personalities.
One of the fears around a left of centre vote with a low support for Labour is that you're going to have a bit of a mix and a very difficult coalition to try and manage, and whether it actually can be kept together for that time. Real fear or not?
There's been 4 parties supporting the current government, hasn't there?
This one's a little bit more fragmented, I would argue.
Would you?
Yeah.
We'll have to. I mean, if you think about who the 4 parties are, I don't know about that. They've voted together in the opposition well. They've collaborated on campaigns. So the paid parental leave campaign, they all collaborated on. The referendum on asset sales, they all collaborated on.
National would have a far better majority than what Labour would have, more ability to control that side in what we've seen over the last...
Well, they've lost their majority. There's no assessment of how they've managed their 4 political parties, but the reality is they've had to rely on different parties to get through legislation, and some of it they haven't been able to get through at all. The paid parental leave bill was going to go through, Labour's paid parental leave bill was going to go through, and they were going to have to veto it, use their power of veto, and now they've lost their majority and were unable to get the employment legislation passed before Parliament shut up shop for the election. So, stable government, unstable government, obviously they would like to spin that a new coalition of 4 parties would be unstable, but they can continue to rely on 4 parties. Some less than savoury characters, and have managed to govern for this period.
Why aren't you an MP?
I've got a good job, and I'm committed to the work that I'm doing.
Can you do more outside of Parliament than inside of Parliament?
No, I believe everyone can make a contribution somewhere, and I really respect those that go into Parliament, and I, think we need to stop having a go at them and actually about their personalities or about all the minor things, and have a look at what they stand for. But the work that I'm doing is an incredibly important job, along with all the other people that are working with me in the union movement. It's a job that has to be done, actually. Working people need a better, fairer go. And that's the work that I'm enjoying doing and like doing.
Very good. I think we'll wrap it up there. It's been very interesting. Thanks for your time. Enjoy your time in Dunedin.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thanks to our guest, Helen Kelly. Next week, we'll have Kevin Hague from the Green Party with us, and we would invite you to join us then. There's a different time. Instead of 1 p.m, that interview will be at 2 p.m. So please join us then. Thanks very much.